COVID-19 has definitely changed our work in a lot of ways.
I knew going into nursing, going into being an ICU nurse, that I was going to take care of the sickest of the sick patients. Did I know I was going to be a nurse during a pandemic? I don't think anything could have prepared me for that.
When the initial COVID-19 surge hit Indianapolis and our hospital, our community, it was like being dropped into a labyrinth in the dark of the night, all alone. It was scary.
Some staff in some units have also asked for more overtly kind of religious support, where they're asking for blessings for their units. You know, they're concerned, people are sick and people are dying and people are vulnerable. Can you come say a blessing for our staff or for a unit, or sometimes even for certain rooms?
When things really started getting tough in my unit, it was a Sunday and I was working and we were putting down breathing tube after breathing tube in these patients. We got up to 14 or 15 ventilators in our 18-bed ICU, and it was just one after the other. And we were all scared, but I didn't see anybody run. I saw my coworkers, my friends, turn into superheroes before my eyes.
There's people who are suffering, there's people in need. We are trained to help them, and we want to help them, and we are going to help them. And this is what we signed up for. This is a time when people are afraid and people are anxious. And this hospital, Cedars-Sinai, is saying, everyone, no matter what, you are welcome here. We will help you. We will gift you. We will embrace you. And we will care for you.
At the end of the day, the most rewarding part of this job is to be able to take a breathing tube out of a patient. And we've started doing that. Patients are getting better. They're still incredibly sick, but they're getting better.
We know that there's still a long road ahead. Many people are still very sick. Many even who are getting better are going to have a very long road ahead. And it's as though the labyrinth is being revealed with all of its twists and turns. And I don't actually really like labyrinths. I get frustrated really fast. It's not my thing. But maybe you're like me, and you take some comfort in knowing that there's at least some perspective.
None of my coworkers regret this. None of my coworkers regret being a nurse, regret being a respiratory therapist, a doctor. We are here to help our patients. Pandemic or not, we're here.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here, and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.